Well, good morning, students. I do apologize for yesterday. This recording did not uh, correctly record. Apparently, I had some technical difficulties and did not know about it. So we're going to pick up where we left off from the night before, Determinants of Learning, Part 3. And this is just a short overview of some of the determinants. And we have a Part 4 also want to discuss. It should only take about 10 minutes. So last week we learned that learning style principles, well, the myth, it was a myth for all intents and purposes. The evidence simply doesn't show that it's necessarily going to improve outcomes. But again, I don't, as a myth, I think it's probably, that's a hard assessment of it. I think it's more along the lines of it may have some validity, but we have to be aware that it does not specifically improve outcomes. And partially because we have so many different people that we're teaching. And as an instructor, a staff, a manager, or if you're teaching patients, you have to realize that. But Gardner's 8 Types of Intelligence, which is in your reading for this week, discusses a lot of these issues. Now, what this graph actually represents is a combination of Gardner's 8 types of intelligence and right brain, left brain theory. And I want you to ask yourself, which applies to you? Now, in Gardner's perspective, we have a lot of different things, such as what is your intelligence? Now, that doesn't mean you don't have all of the intelligences. It just means that you might have a preference for one. If you are artistically inclined, very creative type person, how could, if you had a student like that or a staff member, how could you utilize that to actually help that person learn better? Or if they're strong in mathematics, how could we use them to how can we use that to help them get stronger in their development and how they apply certain things? Honestly, I would say that for me, I taught from particularly mechanical ventilation, pathophysiology, well, at least physiology. I taught a lot from the mathematical perspective, utilizing that, and that unfortunately turned off a lot of students. So I mentioned disease maps, and disease maps were a way that I could draw in my other students who weren't as mathematically inclined. And a disease map, as I described, was basically a mind map. I would encourage you to look up mind maps. Tony Buzan is the creator of mind maps, and they're a very effective tool, in my opinion, because it touches on not only the visual, the auditory, and the kinesthetic, but it actually engages the mind at a lot of different levels. And sometimes students, for example, logical reasoning can be enhanced, even if they're not as logically inclined, or at least they may not think they are. Let me give you an example of a student we had who was artistically inclined. She was doing poorly in some of the theory classes, but when it came to illustrating things as a picture, she could do it so well that it looked like it would come out of a professional anatomist book. And when I saw her drawing one day in class, I asked if I could see it, and she showed me, and I was astounded because it really showed a high level of intelligence for artistic awareness, attention to detail. And so we used that in class to help her develop her skills, but also help the other students. And her attention to detail, she could pull out information just simply by looking at it, and as opposed to trying to memorize it. And once she learned that she could apply her artistic abilities, she was off to the races. So I'd encourage you to read a little bit more about these 8 types of intelligences. I would also say that these are 8 types of talents that people come with. Now there's gonna be this TED Talk that is posted as the 3rd video in this series, but it will not play, unfortunately, and so you can hear it during this presentation. But here's what I want you to do is watch it and then ask what you think now about the right brain, left brain theory. Is it right or is it wrong? So let's go on to determinants of learning part 4. What really determines learning? I think this is ultimately the question, because we've already blown up the idea that learning styles probably don't. And learning theory just gives us a clue as to how we maybe should look at these abilities to learn. And we can't take it out of context and say, this is the one that I'm going to use. Again, I mentioned before, I'm much more of a holistic practitioner of these theories as well as styles. And doesn't mean that I'm perfect at doing it. I simply, if I'm working with students in a classroom, I am mindfully aware of what types of talents they bring or intelligences they bring, and then I try to come up with ideas to help stimulate their learning. But, we talked about this already in the first class. We have to get their attention in order for it to begin to get processed and put into memory storage for both short-term and long-term. Got to get to short-term first and then long-term. But what happens after they learn something in your class for the first time? So when you get that sensory memory, in other words, that information that's coming in through a PowerPoint or a discussion, at least in the beginning, if that's the first time and only time they've heard it, then here's what happens. So conferences are a good example of this. A lot of times what you will find out is that people will, for maybe a couple of hours, right, might remember most of what you spoke about, but within 9 hours, look at the percentage of retention. That's extremely low. This is why, when you go back up here, that we have to engage them in practice in order to get it into long-term memory. And when I mean practice, I don't mean to necessarily do a physical practice, or maybe I do, but it's not. It's practice with the information. So we have to give them something other than just simply recalling the information. So this brings me to this point. Now, you've seen this before. We've got to the left the upside down pyramid of Bloom's taxonomy. Now, the reason create is at the top, of course, is because that's where you want them to go. Now, what does it suggest here? It's suggesting that we want to spend most of our time analyzing, evaluating, and creating rather than trying to get them to simply remember, because simply trying to get them to remember might get you, they might learn their vital signs, they might learn the ventilator parameters, but can they apply them? Can they analyze what they need to do next? Can they evaluate data to create a ventilator care plan for that patient, say based on ARDS or based on any condition? If you require students or staff in your training that they will create a care plan or create a policy, whatever it is you want them to create, they have to be able to remember and understand and apply, because you cannot get to the creation unless you do that. So there's no need to have a bunch of objectives that say the students will identify the ventilator parameters necessary to treat patients with ARDS. They can memorize those all day long, but they won't be able to apply them unless you give them a ultimate goal or objective of creating that care plan. And better yet, don't do it as a lecture. The lecture should probably come after some exercise, with that information. And this is sort of the version of, if you think about, if we want somebody to create or somebody to really understand information, they need to be able to teach. And if they teach others, even if they're right or wrong, they're going to learn through the teaching process, because they will self-correct if they're wrong. And if they're correct, it will help the other students. I always would engage students in groups. And I mentioned during the first session of this class that I believe in using groups, particularly to solve problems, but it works really effective in an educational environment and certainly with staff. You give them ownership of the information when you have them teach others or involve themselves in a discussion group, because what happens is you end up engaging, and that's the key, is engaging. A lecture does not engage, and I'm lecturing now, and I honestly don't want to lecture. I just want to draw these things out. I want to make you think. So I love this graph because it really helps conceptualize what we should be doing as educators. Ultimately, meaning for learner is your desired outcome. I mentioned the other night, we have to get to the why for adults. Well, truthfully, any learner, but in particular adults. We have to answer the what, the where, the who, the how, and the when. But if we don't get to the why, then you won't achieve your desired outcome, because you could talk to your blue in the face to an adult learner, but if they don't understand why they're doing it's not practical for them, because you have to remember they're not a teenager or a preteen who are going to follow whatever you say. These are people that they're adults that have experiences. That's why Malcolm Nowell's and andragogy principles, or andragogical principles, are so important to consider. Um, we need to help that adult learn the why. And when you find your why, you find your answer. And the best way to approach that was taught to us by Socrates. Socrates, Aristotle, Hippocrates, all of these philosophers and physicians that we're somewhat familiar with. I studied Aristotle more extensively in grad school. They did one thing, and they believed in the scientific method. Matter of fact, Aristotle created the scientific method, and it all occurs through questioning, asking the right questions, whether it's clarification or questions about the initial questions or issues or assumptions and questions. Now, what's important to realize, if you've actually done the motivational interviewing, in a sense, that's what you're doing with motivational interviewing. When you interview somebody, you're not making a judgment on what they're saying or not saying. You're just trying to extract or evoke from them what it means to them. Because if we're going to tailor a care plan for a patient, and it has to be individualized, we have to ask clarifying questions, correct? And when they give us an answer, then we also need to probe a little deeper, because that helps us develop that. Now, many of you are doing projects related to patients, and I would encourage you to consider, what types of questions would you ask a patient if you were trying to help them understand their disease process as well as how to treat it. If it's a student, what these are really good questions to ask students, because you want, and I used to do this constantly ad nauseum with my students, and they would, some of them responded extremely well, and some of them would get very upset. And so I would stop at that point and I would ask them, why are you getting upset? And they would say, well, I don't know the answers. And I said, well, precisely. You don't know the answer. What I'm encouraging you to do is to find the answers. If you remember when you were in school and you were in clinical, the best preceptor didn't give you the answer. They ask questions not to necessarily test your abilities or understanding or your ability to remember, but to really make you think. And really, that's the key, is to make you think. So in this process, of learning, we're assessing for learning. In other words, we're asking questions. We're assessing you at the same time. The idea would be that you would be learning from the process. It's not a graded assignment that we would do in this case, but assess for learning. We have them assess themselves for their learning. We have their peers assess them for their learning. And eventually we get to their assessment of learning. That would be your exam or a final paper or something along that lines. But training in new skills requires the full comprehension of information. It begins with those learning objectives that we've been talking about. Then the step 2 is to teach through questioning, not giving answers. Okay, so using the Socratic method. And then practicing before you assess. So in other words, give them some time to play with the information, and if it's a skill, if a physical skill, you have them go to a lab and practice. If it's about disease process, maybe sit around in a group and give them case studies to practice with, that kind of thing. Review and refine and improve. Well, as an instructor, or if you're monitoring a staff group session, you would be the coach. In other words, you get off the stage and you help monitor the activities and guide them, when they need to, in other words, when they get off track, and then provide feedback and assessment of learning. So assessment of learning does eventually come into the picture. And when you do assess for learning or assessment of learning, you have to realize you're going to have to give them that feedback, tell them how to correct it, and then go on to the next objective or reevaluate that current objective and say, if they got the information and they were able to demonstrate that through the assessment. If they didn't, that tells you that you need to repeat the process, or you need more practice, you need more feedback, need more time. So we started and we end with beginning with the end in mind. You want your goals and outcomes to match. So if your goal is to implement protocols in your facility, or if your goal is to have, so students will be able to implement, the goal is to have staff implement protocols for mechanical ventilation in the ICU. That's a goal. Now, how do you get there? Well, the staff will be, after this session, the staff will be able to design a care plan for a patient on a mechanical ventilator with ARDS, with COPD, whatever it is. Now, I could also add, staff will be able to evaluate clinical data to guide that protocol implementation. Okay. How will you measure those? Well, simple. You've got, one, you know what your goal is. You stated that. Two, you want to have them create something. So simply have them set up a ventilator, do the ventilator check, match it with, how you want to approach that, and that would be a way to measure that. You give them the lab data. It's a simulation, is all it is. You give them the lab data, and then they analyze that information, and they evaluate that information, and then they modify that care plan. Okay, so these are all ways to get these things to work together. But stick with, when you're developing your plan for your final project, unless it's dealing with patients, you probably want to go to analyze, evaluate, create. If you're working with patients, you want them to at least be able to remember and understand and apply at some level. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how to apply this depending on the audience. So staff and students, the top three; patients, the bottom three. There's a great article, Do Learners Really Know Best? Urban Legends in Education. This will explode some of the myths of education that I think is important to understand. Not only do we need to know what theory is, we need to know what the principles are, we need to know what works, what doesn't. We also need to be aware that we can't buy in hook, line, and sinker to many of these concepts without evaluating the evidence. So this is a good start. So remember, if you have more questions now, you're thinking, thus learning. The answer lies within, as Socrates would say. If you help others find their why, the how will be much easier. You can change the world through proper questioning. That's important. So ask questions, ask yourself questions, ask your peers questions, ask your professors questions. Questioning things are a good thing. Sometimes we don't have the answers, and that's the purpose of education. All right, that's it. Thank you very much, and I will see you on Tuesday. Hopefully you're well on your way to finishing paper number 3. So far, everything's looking good. Everybody's doing really well on the papers of those that I've received, and I've graded all of them at this time. And this is about 7:30 in the morning on Thursday, July 16th. So hopefully you'll watch this and you'll have finished your paper by then. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.